So you testified that you heard the evidence of Superintendent Morris.
Portions of, yes.
Right. And you said that he's, in your chief, the foremost authority in the province of Ontario regarding intelligence. Is that right?
That is my opinion, yes.
And I take it you agree with his testimonies and the opinions he gave. I take it that's correct.
I have not listened to his testimony in totality, but I would have no reason not to agree with anything that he would provide as evidence.
Right. And I'm sure you might have heard the answers he gave to the questions I put to him with respect to threats under Section 2 of the CONVOY Act. Do you remember hearing that?
I can't say that specifically I remember that interaction.
Right. Well, he testified that essentially, in summary, that there was no intelligence of a credible threat under Section 2 of the CONVOY Act. Would you agree with that?
There was no intelligence of...
There was no credible intelligence.
There was no credible intelligence of a threat.
Yes.
That I would agree with that.
Right.
Yes.
And so it's fair to say that based on all OPP intelligence and the intelligence provided by the RCMP and federal intelligence agencies to the OPP, to your knowledge, there was no credible threat to the security of Canada as defined in Section 2 of the CONVOY Act.
That would be my understanding, yes, as determined by Superintendent Pat Morris in consultation with CSIS and the RCMP.
Thank you. And I'm sure you're aware that to invoke the Emergencies Act, that sort of threat is supposed to be required.
So I do not have intimate knowledge of the threshold that's required for invoking the Emergencies Act. That's not something that I have any responsibility for.
Thank you. And in my next question, when I say federal civil service or federal civil servant, I just want you to understand that I mean anyone from deputy minister down who is a non-elected, non-political actor working for the government of Canada. Is that understood?
That's understood, yes.
Now, in your interactions with the members of the Federal Civil Service prior to 11:59 p.m. on February 13th, 2022, isn't it true that no civil servant ever said to you that there was a credible threat of the nature of that defined in Section 2 of the CONVOY Act?
That is correct.
And they never said to you that they had reasonable grounds to believe that such a threat existed, did they?
Nobody ever said that to me.
Thank you. So I want to talk with you about everyone's given various catchphrases to what was happening in Ottawa, but no one's really gone through what is a protest or, essentially a lawful demonstration, et cetera. And you seem to have an understanding of that. So I'm going to walk through that with you if that's okay.
Certainly.
Can you agree that in general protest law and sort of criminal offenses that you essentially have three types? You have your lawful protest protected under Section 2B and 2, all Section 2 really of the Charter.
Yes.
Yeah. And then you have unlawful assembly.
Yes.
And then you have riot.
Yes.
Right. So those are really the three sort of categories of these assemblies. Is that fair? Demonstrations.
That's fair.
All right. So I just want to start with lawful protest, and you touched on that. And lawful protest, as you said, is protected by the Charter, and that's primarily Section 2. And can you agree that is the freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and freedom of association, they collectively essentially protect people's right to assemble and protest?
Yes.
Right. And people are entitled to gather in groups in public spaces and protest government action as long as they don't essentially move into an unlawful assembly, correct?
Correct, yes.
Right. And they can get together in large numbers, go outside Parliament, and protest.
I can't say to what extent they can go outside Parliament. There's the Trespass to Property Act that has to be taken into consideration as well, and I'm not familiar enough with what is permitted on those grounds to say yes or no.
Right, but they can go in public spaces.
Yes.
Okay. And then unlawful assembly, police have the power under Section 63 of the Criminal Code to arrest and charge people for the offense of unlawful assembly, right?
Yes.
And you don't need any form of special order for that. That can just be carried out by a police officer.
That is correct.
Right. And I take it that you're aware that an unlawful assembly is where three or more people with a common purpose assemble in such a manner and conduct themselves to cause persons in the neighborhood of the assembly.
Slowly when you're reading,
yes. Sorry, I'm now fast, Brendan. I thought I was slow, Brendan, after hearing my friend, but I'll try to get onto that. So it's when they assemble in such a manner that conduct themselves to cause persons in the neighborhood of the assembly to fear on reasonable grounds that they will disturb the peace tumultuously or needlessly cause or provoke other persons to disturb the peace tumultuously. You're aware of that?
I'm aware of that. That sounds very familiar with what is in the criminal code. I hesitate to agree word for word without having it in front of me, but it sounds very reasonable. Thank you.
And I take it you're aware that to disturb the peace tumultuously requires there to be more than a boisterous or noisy, disorderly conduct. It has to be something a little more.
Yes.
Right. And you know that causing an actual disturbance of the peace tumultuously actually isn't required to even arrest people for unlawful assembly. It just has to be that there's a reasonable fear that it's going to happen. That's what really differentiates it from a riot, right?
I would agree with that.
Right. And that an unlawful assembly, you know, a lawful assembly can at times, of course, become an unlawful assembly when it becomes unruly and gets into the riot category, right?
Yes.
Okay. And so I understand, and you probably understand, that a riot, in order to get into a riot under the law, it requires actual or threatened force or violence in addition to, you know, the public disorder, right?
Yes.
And even without this, if you don't even get to that threshold, you're aware, and we've heard about the Riot Act and the Criminal Code, that a mayor, a sheriff, or a justice of the peace, or a justice of the Ontario Court of Justice can come out and read the Riot Act and invoke it and demand people disperse.
I'm familiar that that is contained in the criminal code. I don't have intimate knowledge of that, though.
Right. And then, of course, outside of all of this, you have injunctions. And any individual or the city can run off and make an application for an injunction before a court of competent jurisdiction. And if they meet the test, the court can grant an injunction. And then once that injunction is granted, if it's not followed, the police then have jurisdiction under Section 127 of the Criminal Code to charge individuals with violating a court order.
That is correct, yes.
All right. So those are the general things that exist outside of the Emergencies Act, right? They're there always.
That is correct, yes.
Okay. So I now want to talk to you about Ottawa in particular, now that we've gone over that. Now, regarding the truckers and the protesters in Ottawa, I understand they rolled in here and did so at the direction of police officers once they arrived. Not, of course, they weren't invited. But when they arrived here on January 27th and 28th, is it your understanding that they parked where they were told to originally, and everything was essentially coordinated originally about where they were going to go?
I don't know that I can comment with accuracy on that, because as you will recall from my previous testimony, I was under the understanding that there would be designated parking which would not facilitate any form of protest out in front of the Parliament buildings.
Okay.
So that would best be posed to Ottawa Police, who were in charge of the operation at the time.
And we can agree then that, you know, parking on streets and highways in a way that would usually violate the law, right, where they're essentially blocking everything, that could be considered an unlawful assembly.
That could be, yes. And there are authorities to deal with that.
Right. And I take it, though, you're familiar with the doctrine of officially induced error, where the government official tells you to do something that may be illegal, but because they tell you to do it, you don't believe it to be. You're familiar with that from your studies.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
The doctrine of officially induced error, where a government official tells you to do something that may in fact not be legal, but you do it because the government official tells you to, and therefore you believe that it is legal because they told you to do it. Are you familiar with that doctrine?
That's a very complex law that is beyond my education and comprehension. I'm sorry.
It's okay. So now you do know that after these vehicles arrived in the city, that there was construction equipment, as well as eventually, I believe the following day, cement barriers put up so that no one could come in, but no one could also go out. You're aware of that, the vehicles.
I was aware that there were cement barriers in place, but I was not on the ground to observe where they were or what impact they would have had.
Right, but you can agree with me that if there's barriers on both sides of a road where individuals have parked their trucks, the truck can't drive through the barrier, it can't drive over it, it can't really drive around it. Is that fair? That
sounds reasonable, yes.
Right. If I could bring up document ssm.nsc.can.0000209_rel.0001. It's the incident response group minutes from February 10th, 2022.